Okay, so part 2 of this is to show you how to render. So I've brought up my render view here. I can zoom in and see that I have all of these kind of little grainy bits. So the same is true for my shiny material, and then definitely true here for the transparent. And that is because we need to increase our render settings. So we need to increase the number of samples. So I'm gonna go ahead and save this out. So I had just clicked into render view, rendered this out. So file and save image. I want to make sure that I'm saving the color managed image, and then I'm going to say render texture intro render test default samples, and then say save. All right, make sure it is actually saved. So we go into my documents, into Maya. Documents, Maya, projects, fall 2020, and into my default textures. And yeah, there in images, there is my JPEG image. So I'm gonna go back in, shut this down, and then I'm gonna play around with some render settings. So and we get into render settings with that little clapboard and the little gear. And I am using my Arnold renderer. I need to, the default settings when I say save as JPEG, it actually overrides these settings, but because because I'm paranoid, I like to kind of set them there too. So this is really only when you get into kind of batch rendering are these things important. So the HD 540, that's fine for these tutorials. What I really want to do is make sure I'm using the Arnold renderer and then go in and change the Arnold render settings. So remember, all of these settings will change the samples for different types of light occurrences. So the diffuse is going to increase the samples for diffuse materials, things like the Lambert and then the floor. Anytime light is scattering or diffusing over a material, so I want to increase that probably to something more like 5. The specular, that's going to be like on the Fong and the blends over here, and then probably the antistrophic as well. So that has to do with kind of light shininess and reflections, right? So I'm going to increase everything, I think, probably to 5, and then see what that does. The transmission is the light going through an object, so all of the kind of fireflies going on over here, or the kind of graininess on my transparent object, that's the transmission. The subsurface scattering is kind of like, I think the Fong has quite a bit of subsurface scattering. That's what makes it look more pearlescent, kind of like a shiny pearly metal, so the light is actually kind of bouncing around on the inside of the material just a little bit. Skin and marble have a lot of subsurface scattering as well. And then this indirect, so that's all of the light bounces. So like once the light hits the floor, for instance, it kind of bounces back up. So that has to do a lot with like the underlighting that you can see in the preview here, and then any of so anytime light hits an object and bounces onto another object, that's the indirect lighting. So I'm not going to change the camera. I'm going to just increase all of these kind of individuals. So the camera setting is actually a multiplier of all of these. So you can go in and dial in all your settings down here, and then increase the camera will multiply all of those samples times the camera. So increasing that is actually going to increase your render time quite a bit. So I'm gonna just do a little preview with these settings kind of set up as is. So let's go in and do my render. And I can't zoom in, but already I think I can tell from out here that it looks pretty good. And you can see it's gonna, it takes slower, right, to do these transmissions, these kind of translucent objects. So I kind of talked about that a little bit in our class, but it's much harder. the GPU, the graphics, and the CPU, if you're rendering, depending on what you're rendering on, it just takes more computation to calculate how the light bounces through an object versus kind of a reflection or, on the material surface itself. So those take a little bit longer. I can tell that I'm going to have to keep increasing the camera samples for the transmission, and I'll probably need to bump up the diffuse. Looks okay, so I'm going to see if I can go in, dial in with just the specular looks pretty good too. Maybe the indirects. It might be just reflecting. Yeah, I think here, the graininess that I'm seeing here is actually just because it's reflecting the graininess of this diffuse material. So I'm going to go in and bump up the diffuse. Specular looks pretty good. Maybe a little more on the I think all of this graininess that I'm seeing is also kind of the diffuse graininess. So let's just go in and change the transmission and the specular samples. I'm going to just save this for reference. Save image. I think I was saving as JPEGs. I think I've asked you to save as PNGs. For these tests, it's not as important that you're saving in uncompressed file formats, but I think it's just good habit. If you want to just use one image file type, use PNG. And then I'm going to save this file name. I can't. Okay, fine. Texture, intro. So when I'm doing a render test, camera 3, rest 5. So when I'm doing these render tests, I like to use either like a chart, so type in all of my render settings in like a spreadsheet, and render 1, render 2, render 3, or if it's actually usually easier for me to just type those settings into the file name so I know what's what. And for, let me shut that. So for these kind of one-off tests, indirect, I'm gonna do 7 and diffuse, maybe 9, and then specular. Specular was good. Transmission I want to bring up. Let's see. Okay, so volume indirect. So I've left specular and subsurface at 5, and I've increased the indirect, the transmission, so that indirect is going to be like light bouncing off of things, which happens a lot with like diffuse materials. The diffuse material itself, and then the transmission, which is light going through things. So I'm going to try that again. So I like to use the kind of changes in the file names. That way I don't have to kind of refer to a secondary chart. And this doesn't become too much of an issue when we're rendering out single images. It's fine, to wait. For some of your computers, though, it sounded like, you had 5-hour renders for a single still image, right? So once we start rendering out at 24 frames per second, you can see how these render times and how these render settings become really important. You want to get the maximum, you're trying to find that perfect balance between, render samples and then kind of fast renders, right? So time versus quality, and you're constantly dealing with that kind of time versus quality when you're in production for yourself using, your own computer. You can log in, and for folks that are having those kind of like crashing Mayas or renderings taking too long, you can log in to our computers remotely, and we have a couple really fast machines that are up and running right now. And then Lucas, our IT guy, is going to be getting the rest of the Mac computers online in our labs. So those are iMacs. They're not, as fast as the Alienwares that we have for VR, but they're much faster than a lot of the laptops that you all are working with. And they're also have the added benefit that you can log in, start the renders on those computers, and then you can go ahead and use your computer for other activities, right? So it's not clogging your own computers with render time. I tend to start my renders at night, so while I'm sleeping, my computers are kind of chugging away, and that's another good option. But obviously that means that you need to start your renders well in advance of when the due dates for the projects. So you can see it's going to hang on these areas where we have increase the render settings, right? So it just takes more time to calculate out like these kind of like width, shininess, right? So like anytime you have a reflection, anytime you're looking through an object, and I can still see that I still have some graininess over here in the transmission. So I think I need to increase the transmission all the way to 10 and probably actually more like 15, because it's still quite a bit here. You can still see like quite a bit of scatterness. So I'm going to do that again. Save file, save image, and then texture. Oop, there we go. Camera 3, transmission, specular. No, I left it was transmission, indirect, and then diffuse. No, yes, diffuse. 9. Breast 5. And then shut that down, and then I'm gonna say volume indirect. That looks pretty good. It was really just the transmission. So I'm gonna say maybe 15 here, and keep everything else because everything else looks pretty good. And then render. Yeah. So I think this might be a case for that kind of like it could be an issue now of the reflection to the specular, but that looks super clean on the other. So I think it would just be yeah, the diffuse looks good too. So I think it's really just a matter of kind of probably setting it even higher. So I'm gonna do a couple more render tests, and I will let you know what I find out. Okay, so a couple tests later, I think what I like the best is a camera setting of 5, and then a transmission setting of 25. And I'll show you a couple side-by-side tests in a second. But first I want to show you what's happening here inside of my my render viewport. I have created a render region. So it's only Maya is only calculating out the pixels within this white box. And I can turn it on and off with this little crop tool, and then draw a boundary around the image that I want to render, or the area of the image that I want to render. And that allows you to do, especially if you have a slower computer, it allows you to do these tests quickly and efficiently. And this is in the Arnold render view. So I'm going to shut this down and show you how to get into that. So we've been going in through IPR and then through the Maya render view. So you see render view up here. Oops, escape. Never open render view, Rhonda. And then the Maya render view. And it will incorporate Arnold render settings through both of these Maya native render views. But there is also this clapboard with a little eyeball. That is the Arnold render view. So I can click, oh, actually it should be, but we'll open up through here. So Arnold, we'll say open Arnold render view here. There we go, Arnold render view. And then this is, there are a couple different settings up here, right? And so we're going to be using this crop to render view, and you can click on the button, activate it, and then draw. You can also click it to clear the render viewport. You can also hold down Shift and then draw the outline of the area in question, and it will only render in that region. So I'm going to turn on Run IPR. And so now it is updating. So you need to make sure you turn on that Run IPR after you draw your crop. And you can see that it's processing down here. There's that little percentage. This is actually a percentage of the total image. So this will probably only get up to like 4% or something, maybe 3% of the total image, but you can see that it's rendering out in blocks. And then here, this is the kind of block that's finished, and then it's thinking about the rest. So once I open up that, then I can open up my render settings and then do live updates. Because IPR is turned on, I can change the render samples from like 2, and it will start updating for me. But I kept playing with these, and so the camera render view of 6 produced an even clearer image, but it did take quite a bit longer. And when you increase this camera sample, like I said, it's going to multiply all of these other samples. So not only did it take longer for this little region, but it's going to take longer for your overall image. So let me see if I've got my render comparison here. And so unfortunately, when I was doing it, my fingers brushed my trackpad and changed my point of view, so I don't have a consistent point of view to show you, but it luckily got kind of captured one in between. So this is a camera setting of 6 with the transmission setting to 25, and this is kind of the clearest image that I got. I could, bump it up a little bit further, but I think, for our purposes, this is pretty good. There's still some kind of light, kind of, I guess, kind of crunchiness, right? Or kind of like that, the fuzziness in there. Some noise, there we go. Camera setting of 6, transmission samples of 15. And then this is where my fingers ran through my trackpad. But this is the same settings on the top here for this. But what it will let us do is kind of show you the difference between the camera settings at 6 and then the camera settings at 5. And you can start to see the graininess come through at the camera setting of 5 with the transmission of 25. But I think that that's well within the realm of acceptability. If I was rendering out for a client, I would probably just, use a fast machine and increase these camera settings probably to even like something like 7 or 8. But I think for render tests, this is just fine. And so this took 1 minute and 8 seconds just for that tiny region, right? So if you're rendering a big image, you can imagine. This took 54 seconds, and then at camera sample 5 with 25 it was 51 seconds, and camera sample at 5 with the transmission setting at 15, it took 39 seconds. And you can start to see, it's subtle, but you can see those differences. And then camera setting of 4, which is kind of, I think, where we were in our original settings. So I'm going to render out, I think, at 6 with a transmission setting of 25, and I'll let you know how long it takes, and I'll upload the final image into the assignment, Canvas assignment, so you'll have access to that. All right, I hope that was useful. So one more thing I should show you is from this render viewport. So once you have your camera settings, you want to clear that render region, and so I'll say I like 5 and 25 and everything else looks good. And then I'm going to say allow it to just kind of let's see, unclear, uncheck that. And I'm actually going to do the rendering now, not using the Arnold rendering. I'm going to use the Maya native renderer, but it will the settings will be carried over from the render settings. So I just use the Arnold render view to do the preview work and to do the tests. That is partly because I might be a little overcautious, because when in the first release that I taught, Maya, Arnold had just been integrated into Maya, and so that Arnold render view I found to be particularly buggy and would crash the system. So even just opening is a little make sure you're saving your scenes, right, frequently. So I'll let this render out, and then I will upload all of the images with their render settings to the assignment page so you can see that. Okay, I hope this is useful. Take care. See you soon.